Well, Bill, I was going to actually ask if people want to stand up for a moment just to stretch, so before we enter this very last.
Do you want this here? Okay. Do you need anything?
I don't need it.
All right, I think we are about ready here. Ethan Nadelman is clearly one of the key figures in the drug policy reform movement. He is the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, which he founded as the Linda Smith Center, its name until just a few months ago. Before founding that organization in 1994, Dr. Nadelman taught political science, right? Political science at Princeton for 7 years. He's often described as the point man for drug policy reform and is without question not only one of this country's, but one of the world's leading experts on a number of these issues. He's also been quite helpful to me, to the Baker Institute, in giving suggestions about program, but also in helping to one of the several people who have been very helpful in helping us find some support for this program. And it's a delight for me to welcome Ethan Nadelman to the Baker Institute and to talk to us about what we do after the war on drugs. We've been moving beyond it all for the last 2 days. What do we do now?
Okay, Bill, thank you very, very much. So, no, it's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to have the Baker Institute do this. Grateful to the ambassador and others who made this possible. I have to say, sitting here and listening to the range of presentations, and I started to get even more depressed than I normally do about the prospects for the future. I mean, Sano Tree started going about Latin America right after Gina's presentation. I'm like, oh my God! And quite frankly, it was very appreciative that Asa Hutchison, the head of the DEA, was here, but there was very little to find encouraging in his presentation. And I have to say the same thing for Lee Brown. I mean, it was encouraging not to be preaching war on drugs rhetoric, but there was an inside-the-box nature to the ways of thinking about treatment, prevention, everything else that suggests we're not going to be moving forward in this way. I mean, the situation is a horrible one. There's no question about it. You look around the world, globally speaking, and what you see is that we're living under a global prohibition regime that has been developed over the course of almost a century, going back to the beginning of the 20th century. It's one where the most powerful nation on earth has been an active proselytizer and promoter of a policy of punitive prohibition for almost a full century, essentially exporting and promoting our own highly pseudo-moralistic, punitive views on how to deal with drugs, essentially internationalizing as much as possible the war on drugs. And quite frankly, we have a peculiar American angle on this. We are one of the few countries in the Western world that actually prohibited alcohol. There is a temperance ideology that goes deep to our core. It's one that resulted in prohibition laws at the state level in the 19th century and national prohibition in the 20th century. It's a temperance spirit and a prohibitionist ideology that morphed essentially from alcohol into drugs after the 1930s. And that's something that we've had the power and the capacity to impose and to persuade on other nations all around the world. Part of this is not just the diplomatic power of the United States and the pressures we put both bilaterally, multilaterally, discreetly, overtly on other governments. It's also the existence of a transnational police force, the DEA, the customs and others, which are involved in training programs and building the whole transnational police culture that's essential to the fight against terrorism, but that has also become, really pulled together on the basis of the drug war. So there are layers and layers in which the war on drugs system has penetrated into all these societies. Even when we talk about Europe, I mean, Alex made the point that the key difference between Australia and the United States was not in the extent or nature of drug use that much, nor was it even in policing. As he pointed out, Australia's policy is heavily supply reduction-oriented, law enforcement-oriented as well. It was really in the harm reduction piece. That supply reduction, that law enforcement police is really universal. Even in Switzerland and the Netherlands, the police cooperate in investigating, transnational smuggling of ecstasy and heroin and cannabis and what have you. In the United States, I mean, you know the numbers. I don't know if they've actually been said in the last day or two, but from 50,000 people behind bars in 1980 to almost 500,000 people locked up in this country today for violating a drug law. America locks up more people for drug law violations than the entire European Union locks up for everything, and they have maybe 50 or 100 million more people than we do. I mean, this is astronomical numbers. We've developed a callousness, a tolerance for levels of incarceration that now rank first in the world. I mean, the Russians keep trying to huff and puff and keep up with us in locking up their population, but they just can't do it. We have a rate of incarceration of African Americans that exceeds the rate of the incarceration of black South Africans under apartheid South Africa. We have a rate of incarceration that approaches that of the Soviet gulags in the 1950s. And we've grown very accustomed, So that's the bad news. So what does the possibility and the strategy for reform, and so what I'm going to try to do is, as much as possible, finish up on a more upbeat, optimistic tone of where we might actually move forward and lay out some potential model to try to discern the little silver linings on all these gray and black clouds of prohibitionist drug war around the world that might be pulled together. And let me lay it out in terms of if the model here, right, and there's what we, the drug policy reform movement that is growing in the U.S. and around the world, what do we strive for? We strive for the day and for a change in political consciousness so that our children, hopefully our children, and certainly our grandchildren, will look back on the drug wars of the late 20th and early 21st century the same way that today we look back on slavery and Jim Crow and the bigotry and prejudice against gay Americans and against women and what have you. That's what we're striving for. We're striving for that fundamental transformation in consciousness. We are striving for a policy that essentially focuses not on the chimerical, on the foolish and unattainable goal of eliminating or eradicating drug use, of creating a drug-free world, but rather on a pragmatic, common sense-based, human rights-driven, science and public health-derived policy and set of objectives that focus on reducing the cumulative death, disease, crime, and suffering associated both with drug use and with drug control policies. The ideal drug policy to our minds is one that begins with the assumption that we will never be a drug-free world, that states the challenge as not being one of getting rid of drugs, but of one of learning to live with drugs so that they cause the least possible harm and the greatest possible benefit, and that ultimately evaluates success or failure by asking the question, did these policies succeed in reducing the death, disease, crime, and suffering associated both with the inevitability of drug use as well as with the drug control strategies that governments adopt in order to deal with the problems of drug abuse? That's what we're striving for. Now, what's the optimistic view of how this happens? Let's take 3 centers, and we'll put a little fourth bank shot over here, which is a much more of a long shot. But look at Latin America, look at Europe, look at the United States, and then we'll take some little consideration to the developing world in China and India. First of all, what you see emerging, we had Peter and we had Francoise and others talking about this in Europe, and Eugene and Alex about Australia and Canada. It's about the emergence of an alternative policy in other parts of the world. 20 years ago, the Dutch were all alone in advocating cannabis decriminalization and some forms of harm reduction. But now you see in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, you see it throughout growing parts of Western Europe. You see little pieces popping up in other parts of the world that basically are advocating the harm reduction approach. The notion that we must accept that drugs are here to stay and focus on reducing the harms of drug use and of our prohibitionist policies. What's emerging now, as the Dutch continue to slowly, deliberately, in their own peculiar Dutch way, institutionalize an alternative approach, is that whereas they were once isolated, now we see the Swiss moving ahead and actually leapfrogging the Dutch. We may well open the newspapers next year and see the headline, Swiss vote to legalize cannabis, right? The Dutch legalized the retail side. The Swiss are figuring out how to do the wholesale side. What happened, as Mike Trey said in the film this morning with David Blunkett, the new home minister, basically calling for the rescheduling of marijuana. You look at the public opinion polls in Canada, where almost 50% support marijuana legalization. We went down, Marcia Rosenbaum and I, and a month before us, Peter Cohn and Alex Wodak were in New Zealand in late 2001, and you see a select committee of the parliament, including members of the cabinet, calling for the legal regulation of cannabis. So you see some transformation happening there. You see the emergence, I think, heroin trials, safer injection rooms, harm reduction-oriented policing strategies, which means essentially policing drug markets the way we would police prostitution, focusing on the harmful aspects rather than just a blind assault in the way that Lee Brown suggested was the only way the police can operate, right? And the legal regulation, slowly backing into first the de facto and then the de jure regulation, not just of cannabis possession and cultivation, but of distribution as well. We see the emergence of an alternative model in Europe, and in a Europe in which there remain very powerful ideological resistance to the types of push towards universal drug testing we're seeing in the United States, and certain resistance to the whole drug court model in its more pernicious manifestations as we see in the United States. An alternative model that offers some guidance for the rest of the world, some legitimacy for alternative models for other parts of the developing world looking for which way to go. The U.S. policy of punitive prohibition, which has been the dominant model for much of the post-World War II era, is now being challenged in small but growing ways throughout Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. It's not a lot, but it's beginning to coalesce, and efforts are underway to cause this to coalesce a little more vigorously. We're beginning to see these things bubble up and even enter into the deliberations in Vienna and Geneva, where the international drug control forces and HIV prevention forces all mobilize and meet. Now in Latin America. Well, the problem in Latin America has always been that that's a continent that has shown over 2 centuries that it's historically incapable of ever banding together in its own self-interest when the United States has an alternative view of Latin American self-interest. Now, what that means is that even as more and more of these countries have come to appreciate the extent to which most of their drug problems are in fact the result of a futile and counterproductive U.S. war on drugs, they've been unable to do anything with this. They've been intimidated. I can't tell you how many gatherings I've been to, sponsored by the Inter-American Dialogue and the Council on Foreign Relations and all the other sorts of inter-American groups, where essentially 2 dialogues happen. There's a dialogue that happens when people gather around the tables during the day, and everybody says, yes, we have to agree that we should reduce supply, and yes, we have to reduce demand, and yes, we have to respect each other's sovereignty, and yes, we have to do the carrot and the stick of crop substitution and alternative development. And of course, let's not have this drug issue stay on the front burner for too long. We have other more important issues to deal with. And then walk away. And of course, that's been the dialogue for much of the last 30 or 40 years, even as the problems have escalated. Now, of course, what happens in those meetings is they break up, and people go back, and if you're in South America, they go and sit down and have their pisco sour or whatever the local drink is, and people start talking about, this is crazy. This is ridiculous. I mean, let's face it. Latin America's drug problems, and we have some local drug problems in Latin America, but it's mostly the problems of prohibition. I mean, Colombia, let's face it, it's like Chicago under Al Capone times 50. And Mexico's looking that way, and Peru and Bolivia's gone that way, and we know that what the U.S. is doing, all this push-down, pop-up, and applauding the successes, as Gina pointed out, of eradicating drugs in Bolivia and Peru, and it pops up in Colombia, and it pops up down, that's not doing anybody good, except it's messing around with Latin America. And what happens is, 50% of the people who are sitting around that table nodding their heads to reduce supply and reduce demand, the whole bit, just say, this is crazy. We should just be legalizing this stuff. And another 25% say, well, you're right, but we can't really talk about it because it's never going to happen. And the last 25% said, anybody mentions that legalization word, I'm leaving. I'm never going to associate with some immoral approach like that. But what's begun to happen is that alternative dialogue keeps popping up. And it's popping up more and more and more. What was it, when Jorge Castaneda, the Mexican foreign minister, came in? But there was the article he wrote 2 years ago in Newsweek International saying the only solution for Mexico really ultimately is legalization. And then what happened? The president of Uruguay, Jorge Bacha, he said the same thing, and he didn't eat his words after that. And then a few months ago, Vicente Fox, the president of Mexico, gets asked by a journalist, one of your senior police officials, he said, just called for legalizing drugs. What do you think, Mr. Fox? And President Fox says, well, in the long run, it's the only answer. I mean, not going to do it now, and of course Mexico can't go it alone. And then he did all the proper caveats, and there was no public reaction from the U.S. government, although I'm sure there was a private one. But nonetheless, he revealed his thinking. Right? You see in Colombia, right? I mean, how many ex-presidents will privately say that this is the only answer for their country? And you see in the Colombian parliament these people popping up and saying this stuff. And you go down to Brazil and you see prominent politicians saying that. When my organization published a 2-page letter, the public letter to Kofi Annan in 1998 in the New York Times, if you looked at the list of people who signed that strongly worded letter, calling for an opening of a real debate and castigating the prohibition approach, it included Pérez de Cuellar, the former UN Secretary General, included Belisario Betancourt, the former president of Colombia, included leaders from both sides of the political parties in Nicaragua and Costa Rica, and Mario Vargas Llosa from Peru, and you name it. There's something simmering beneath the surface in Latin America, and the question is how and in what framework does it bubble up, does it come up? Right? What's been missing in Latin America and what we're struggling to find ways to accomplish is a way to coalesce that. I was in the Caribbean last week, mostly on vacation, but had an opportunity to talk with some local politicians and media there. And what you see there, too, is they all know how absurd and destructive and futile this policy is. It's a common phenomenon. Right? That if you ask people who handle the international aspects, trying to eliminate the drugs in Bolivia and Colombia and Asia and Afghanistan and Burma, and you ask them, well, what do you think about the solution? What do they say? They say, well, you're not going to solve it here. The answer lies in reducing demand back in the U.S. And then you go to the American inner cities and you ask the people who deal with drug use and drug addiction in the inner cities, what's the answer? And they say, well, the answer doesn't lie here. The answer lies over there and cutting off the supply coming out of those countries. And then you talk to Coast Guard and Customs, supposed to interdict the drugs. And you say, well, where do you see the solution? They say, well, I'll tell you this. It doesn't lie over here. It lies over there. You got to reduce the supply and the demand, right? And then finally, they all kind of give them. They say, where the answer really is, it's not in going after the drugs. It's in going after the money. Follow the paper trail. Go after the money. And then, of course, you go and you talk to the people who work on the money, and they say, the answer doesn't lie here. Are you crazy? Multi-trillion-dollar economy? You want to find those few billions or tens of billions? Typically you find that whenever you ask somebody involved in the drug control business where the answer lies, they always believe that the answer lies in that area about which they know the least. Well, we got to break out of this. So I think in Latin America, what we know is simmering beneath the surface. It is the story of the emperor with the naked emperor, right? The emperor with no clothes, and the little boy who finally points out and somebody says it. It's just below the surface. And the U.S. government, I can tell there are anecdotes up the gazoo, and there's confirmed evidence in many cases, has pursued a very systematic policy of trying to preclude any serious dialogue or debate. Ranging from calling off a World Bank conference at the last minute on the econometric aspects of the drug trade because a few of the wrong people had been invited. From doing things like having the representative in Geneva ensure that WHO reports get edited so that no terminology is used that's unacceptable to the U.S. Our diplomats telling foreign officials don't use the word harm reduction because harm reduction means legalization. To which the Australians and the Dutch and the Swiss say, well, wait a second, harm reduction is our official national policy and we haven't legalized drugs. But consistent pressure to suppress the emergence of a dialogue or a debate. Well, those are the two places outside the U.S. Now, there's a third possibility, and this is really a faint one. But China and India, with something like a third of the world's population between those two countries, they are now confronting situations where HIV/AIDS related to illicit drug use and injection drug use could take off on a magnitude that begins to resemble the AIDS rates in Southern Africa. That's what they're dealing with right now. There could be, in 5 or 10 years, millions upon millions of people, both injecting drug users and their lovers and their children, infected with HIV/AIDS, never mind hepatitis as well, if they choose to pursue the policies of the United States government. Russia's at risk as well, but let's focus on those two. Now, we know China's disposition is not to necessarily do the most scientific-based thing, but there is a pragmatic spirit that exists there. And India is confronting some serious issues as well. It's a long shot and it's a bank shot, but there is just that possibility that contemplating the possibility of millions of their citizens becoming infected with HIV/AIDS and beginning to emulate the Southern African nations in their HIV rates, but not as a result of sexual contact, but as a result of illicit drug use and counterproductive policies, that we may see some radical breakthrough there. But ultimately, the transformation is going to depend upon an internal domestic transformation within the borders of the superpower that dominates global policy in this area. That's where it's got to happen. Now, it's not as if nothing is happening in the United States. Things are happening in the United States. I mean, there is a growing drug policy reform movement that goes across the political spectrum, that draws on support from a George Shultz and a William Buckley and a Milton Friedman and a Governor Gary Johnson on the right, to a whole range of others, and mayors, and Kurt Schmoke and Rocky Anderson and Salt Lake, and a whole range of others on the left. And throughout, there is that emerging movement, a movement that seeks to follow in the footsteps of other movements for political and social justice, those that fought for gay rights and civil rights and the abolition of slavery and what have you. But we're also getting real. We started learning some of this stuff. We started doing public opinion polls and focus groups. We started trying to identify where is the public peeling off against the war on drugs. And the first issue was medical marijuana. We saw right there by the mid-1990s that between 60 and 70% of Americans believe that marijuana should be legally available for medical purposes if a doctor recommends it. And we went into California, where there had been a local drafted initiative, and we won that initiative with 56% of the vote in 1996, getting a higher percentage of the vote than President Clinton got in that state. And then we went to other states, to Alaska and Washington State and Oregon, and to Colorado and Nevada and Maine and Washington, D.C., and we won the same things over there as well. Why was medical marijuana that important? It's not a pivotal issue. It's not locking up hundreds of thousands of people. But it showed that the emerging drug policy reform movement could play ball in the real world of American politics. It showed that we could win. And the imagery helped us. One of our big problems with the drug policy reform movement is that so much of the imagery, especially on television, plays in favor of the drug war. Banging down doors, the horrible victims of drug abuse, crack cocaine, all of that is beautiful for television. Our issues, methadone maintenance, heroin maintenance, clean needles, terrible TV. It almost hurts us to have those issues put on TV. Medical marijuana transformed the imagery of who the marijuana user is in America. It was no longer the kid in the tie-dye T-shirt smoking and not going to school. All of a sudden, it was the grandma and the aunt and people with AIDS and people in wheelchairs using this stuff as a medicine. It was a compassion issue. And there's a reason why, to my knowledge, neither the current DE head nor the former drugs or other drugs will ever go face-to-face with a patient or a doctor involved in medical marijuana, because they know this comes down to a compassion, and it's compassion backed by science that the National Academy of Science and other research has already established. We won something there, right? Now we're moving forward in the state legislature. Marijuana policy project moving in some of the states, in Maryland and Vermont and a range of others. Other states trying to bubble this stuff. The state of Hawaii actually passed medical marijuana through the state legislature. In New Mexico, we got that close to coming through, and other states are going to endorse this stuff soon enough. Then we found on the issue of asset forfeiture. When American citizens understand that the police or the prosecutors can seize and keep your property without criminally convicting you, they don't like it. And not just liberals don't like it, even more so, the guys on the right don't like it. In Congress, you get coalitions that involve Barney Frank and John Conyers literally holding hands with Henry Hyde and Bob Barr. You got Pat Leahy and Orrin Hatch coalescing on this issue. We ran initiatives on this issue in the year 2000 in Oregon and Utah, and we won both of them 2-1 margins. And then legislation went through in Missouri, and we're going to see if legislation goes through in Colorado this year and in a range of other places. These are building left-right coalitions. And in the process of building those coalitions, the people who join begin to understand other aspects of what's wrong with the war on drugs. And finally, on the issue of providing treatment instead of incarceration. for nonviolent drug possession offenders. We won an initiative requiring that treatment be given instead of incarceration in 1996 in Arizona. Then again in California in 2000. Then we polled in Florida, Ohio, and Michigan, and we found that we were getting even bigger measures of support. 2/3 of the public saying they wanted to do this in those states. Florida, Ohio, and Michigan turning out better numbers than California showed us in the year 1999. So we're going to see in Ohio a Prop 36 type initiative like in California. In Michigan, we're probably going to see an initiative that combines treatment instead of incarceration with a measure of sentencing reform that provides a little truth in sentencing from our perspective in terms of incarcerating and prosecuting drug kingpins. Maybe we'll have one in Washington, D.C. Maybe we'll have a medical marijuana initiative in Washington, D.C. We're moving forward. What we're seeing is the public is ahead of the politicians. The public is ahead of the politicians. The public is ahead of the politicians. Now the question is, how to get the politicians to pay attention? Well, part of that is the local organizing, and we're seeing that happen. I'll tell you this, based upon recent confidential conversations, the prospects for Rockefeller drug law reform, which we thought were dead at the end of last year when we didn't make it through after September 11th, it seems like the governor, Pataki, is showing more flexibility than he's ever shown before. Maybe something will happen. In Washington state, just a few weeks ago, major drug sentencing reform legislation just became law. In Hawaii, there's a bill. Last year, in states like Indiana and Louisiana, through no efforts of the reform movement that I'm aware of, but simply for budgetary reasons with a little dose of compassion thrown in, they got rid of some of their mandatory minimums and they engaged in sentencing reform. Governors and legislators who told us to take a walk a few years ago when we came to them with drug sentencing proposals are now saying in Illinois and Wisconsin and a whole range of other states, we want to see those proposals again. In New Mexico, we got through 8 drug policy reform bills in the last 2 years. We didn't get the big ones of cannabis decriminalization, but we got overdose prevention, we got clean needles, we got more money for treatment, we got a whole range of other types of bills in bipartisan work between a governor and a Democratic legislature that had worked together on almost nothing, managed to get some of these things in the face of locals who thought this would never be possible. So something is bubbling up. I look at the state of Washington right now, I look at the state of Connecticut, and you see high-level legislators, and California, and to some extent New York, and a range of others, and there are people sitting and chairing key committees from appropriation to judiciary to health that are essentially drug policy reformers and increasingly willing to talk that language. At the local level, it's mayors trying to struggle to do the right thing. Look at Seattle and look at Portland. Look at Rocky Anderson in Salt Lake City. Look at Jim Bakken trying to do it in Albuquerque. What you see is people trying to do the right thing in this sort of thing. In Vancouver, mind you, just over the border, we're trying to look at them for models, right? Now it appears that Canada may be joining Switzerland, Netherlands, and Germany and others in embracing heroin maintenance trials. And that'll be happening right across the border, a few miles from the United States. Marijuana, of course, is a pivotal issue. As has already been pointed out, half the drug arrests in this country on marijuana. Perhaps a quarter of the people locked up in prison or jail on marijuana charges, and all the other insidious sanctions being added here and there and there. What do we see is that public opinion is moving. USA Today put its poll out a few months ago. It found 33% of Americans, when asked the question, should marijuana be legal, say yes. And that's the highest number they found since they started polling a decade or a generation ago. We know from polling in other states that in some states, especially in the West, the numbers are beginning to hit 40% and over. In Alaska, there was some polling that showed close to 50% of the public supporting the legalization of marijuana. When some local activists put an initiative to legalize marijuana on the ballot in that state in the year 2000, and it was an initiative that had basically everything in the kitchen sink in it, they still got 40% of the vote. A more carefully drafted initiative might have gotten very close to 50%. We're seeing those numbers move up. Just as in Canada and the United Kingdom, where support for marijuana legalization jumped from the mid-30s to the high 40s in a few years, that could happen too. And if you think about it, culturally speaking, what is it? Half of all Americans between the ages of 20 and 50, 20 and 60 have now smoked a joint at least once. We can't even find a presidential candidate anymore who will say that he's never smoked marijuana. This is increasing. 80 million Americans, this is increasingly part of our culture. Increasingly part of our culture. The generation that thought marijuana, heroin, what's the difference? Not as many Americans like that anymore. And then you ask the question from a moral/policy perspective. You look at the people behind bars, And what you realize is that the vast majority of people who are behind bars in America are there for violating a law and committing a crime which has been regarded as criminal conduct back to the Bible and before. Larceny, theft, rape, murder. And then you got a quarter of that population who are incarcerated for doing something that has no such ancient origins, no such history. And then you have roughly 5 to 10% for marijuana offenses, where literally 1/3 of the population, if not more, doesn't even believe the activity that they're incarcerated for should be a crime. There's something basically wrong there. The marijuana issue. You know, if we look what's happened in Europe, what you tend to see is that cannabis reform and harm reduction have moved forward on two essentially parallel tracks. It's very rare for one to move forward without the other, but cannabis reform and harm reduction moving forward together. And then the United States, the whole sentencing reform is another piece of this thing. So what you see is we put together a report recently, we'll be releasing probably next month. We tried to count up, I think it's in the last 5 years, there's been over 100 drug policy reform bills that have become law, either through the initiative process or through the state legislative process, on overdose prevention, access to clean needles, sentencing reform, treatment, forfeiture reform, medical marijuana, what have you. Something is changing. Something is changing. Now, of course, this takes fuel. It takes money. You know, I and some of my colleagues, Marcia and Deborah, who you heard in the last day or two, you know, we're trying to build a national political organization to end the war on drugs. You know, our models are the Sierra Club and NAACP and the NRA. I mean, anybody who's been successful in accomplishing their mission, those are our models. But there's also a growing range of other organizations focusing on specifically marijuana or clean needles or methadone reform or changing the mandatory minimums. You know, we're entering the era of new and empowered coalition politics, and this movement is no longer solely dependent on the funding of a George Soros, an extraordinarily courageous and generous philanthropist, but he's not alone. More people are coming into this. There is some sense of momentum. More and more, it's becoming difficult for people to look people in the eye and say they really believe in the war on drugs. Now, of course, we know that ultimately, on some level, this is about the kids, right? You know, we hear from the other side. When medical marijuana came along, what was it? Donna Shalale and McCaffrey, they said, oh, we can't do medical marijuana because it'll send the wrong message to kids. Now, do they have any evidence that it would send the wrong message to kids? Actually, none. Zero. In fact, if anything, you got to think that the image of somebody smoking a joint to deal with the nausea associated with chemotherapy or with the symptoms of AIDS, that they're smoking that would send the message that marijuana is sexy, almost seems ludicrous. In fact, if you looked at the polling numbers, a study by Rod Skager in California found that when they polled, they found that after the medical marijuana initiative passed in California in 1996, that adolescent marijuana use did not go up in the same way it did in other states. Now, I don't know if it's because of the medical marijuana initiative, but surely it did not have the consequence predicted. And of course, you know, on needle exchange, what did Christy Whitman, the governor of New Jersey, say when she appoints this expert commission to evaluate whether she should allow access to clean needles in pharmacies and needle exchange programs? She appoints a bunch of Republican businessmen or friends, right? And they go out, they look at the evidence, they come back and say, you know, we're sorry, Governor. We tried here, but all the evidence says that this is the right thing to do, that it'll reduce the spread of AIDS and it doesn't increase drug use. And that's what the National Academy of Science and the Center for Disease Control and the World Health Organization, every single advisory commission we've ever seen has said. And of course, Governor Whitman said, well, Congress had said the same. Well, we asked you for the evidence, and now that we don't like what the evidence came to, we're not going to listen to the evidence. Because, you know, I know in my heart of hearts that needle exchange is wrong, and I know it sends the wrong message to kids. Does it send the wrong message to kids? Clean needles? I sometimes think that every DARE program in America, as part of what it does, should take their kids to visit a needle exchange program. Because what message happens when you take young people to a needle exchange program? It seems to me you get two messages, right? The first message, and I've done this with my students, is they're there and they're standing behind a table there with clean needles and all the other things that they're exchanging the needles, and people are lining up. And what happens is people are lining up, and all of a sudden, you're just sitting behind the table, and you realize that not all those people look like what you thought they were going to look like. Like, you know, like they're not all black. They don't all look like junkies. In fact, some of them are on their lunch break and they're wearing a tie. And others have kids. And some of them look like they're on the last legs and you won't want to see them on a dark corner, and others look like your neighbors. What you realize on some level is that they are us. That realization for kids. And of course, the second message is that when I grow up, I don't want to grow up to stand online at a needle exchange program. That's the other message. You want the scared straight message? Go to the needle exchange. Combine compassion with scared straight all in the same bundle, right? Now, Marcia talked about a new approach, a safety first, reality-based approach to dealing with kids and drugs. What do we know? A majority of American teenagers today lose their drug virginity before they lose their sexual virginity. 50% of high school seniors have tried marijuana or some other illicit substance by the time they graduate. And I was despairing to hear Mayor Brown today. He said, we have two focuses here. First focus is to keep the kids from using drugs in the first place, and the second is to get them off if they start doing it. Well, I don't disagree with those two things, especially the first one. But Mayor, where's your fallback strategy? Where's your fallback strategy for the 50% of kids who have just said yes? Is it just to reiterate, to just say no after they just said yes or just said maybe? There's an absence of pragmatism. Now, the reaction that Marcia and others are getting as they speak around the country is, thank God somebody's speaking honestly and truthfully about the reality of how we deal with our children and the issue of drugs. We don't want our kids to use drugs, but we want that fallback strategy. We want to know what designated driving norms mean. We want to know, because what's our bottom line? Is ultimately the bottom line the do they, don't they question? Is it did they or is that all it is? If you use drugs and that's it, you're lost, which has basically been the dominant just say no message? It seems the real bottom line for the vast majority of parents in America, of which I count myself one with my 13-year-old daughter asking me all sorts of questions, that our bottom line ultimately is not do they or don't they. The bottom line is, are they going to come home safe that night, and are they going to grow up and give us nice grandkids? That's our bottom line. And given the evidence, they talk about in sex education, abstinence plus. We want abstinence plus too. So ultimately, we have a message. We have a message when it comes to the core issue of children and drugs that ultimately is more pragmatic, more science-based, more persuasive, more compassionate, and more real than this war on drugs. It's a matter of keeping it going. We're a growing movement. It's a matter of coalition politics. It's a matter of keeping our eye on the prize and not getting caught up in all the kind of nitty-gritty of organizational, interpersonal, all the other conflicts. It's knowing that we got to fight and we got to keep fighting together even as we fight among ourselves. It's knowing that we're part of a bigger struggle. It's looking at the movements that have gone before us and learning from their lessons. It's not despairing. And it's also watching out. I'm going to finish on these 2 points. First, as Judge Gray said very well yesterday, the drug court model can be an extraordinary step in the right direction, but also an extraordinary step in the wrong direction. If it results in the incorporation of drug treatment into the criminal justice system, we will have taken many steps backward. If alternatively, it results in a temporary mechanism to divert people from the criminal justice system who should not be there in the first place into treatment programs where they can get help and where that treatment is not corrupted and polluted by the oversight of a judge obsessed with looking at the cleanliness or dirtiness of the client's urines, then we will have a major step in the right direction. Secondly, drug testing. That is going to be the new area of battle. You see it happening. I sat in the U.S. Supreme Court a few weeks ago when the case was argued about whether or not all high school kids essentially should be able to be drug tested, and I listened to my government's representative argue that, in fact, not just kids who join basketball teams, but kids who join the glee club and the chess club, and for that matter, all young people should legally and constitutionally, and as a matter of good policy, be drug tested. I sat there thinking that the founding fathers would be rolling over in their graves or pissing in their pants if they heard the justices talking the way they did. I listened to Justice Scalia and Justice Kennedy talk about the druggies and the druggie school. I hope one day, a generation from now, people read the transcripts of those Kennedy and Scalia, and they view them the same way that people view today the racially and other bigoted terms that we've seen in the past. That is the battleground. And what it does mean is that the core principle of the drug policy reform movement, that core principle, as Deborah said the other day, that people should not be punished for what they put into their bodies, that core principle that people should not be punished for what they put into their bodies. Even as we fight the incremental steps, we have to understand that that is our core principle, the one that we have to keep putting out there. Because if we don't put it out there, if we fail to do so, we risk submitting to an ultimately totalitarian control policy that takes advantage of the increasingly sophisticated and new technologies of surveillance, of penetrating our bodies and our skin and the air around us. Technologies that are being designed to deal with terrorism, but that will ultimately be used far more pervasively to deal with drug use. Unless we take that principle and enshrine it in the American political psyche, I really do fear that we will be moving into a world in which people will first be obliged to wear patches to detect, bracelets to detect, then patches and bracelets that actually put into our body antagonists to drugs. We will start with people in the criminal justice system. We will start with people who want the privileges of having enrolled in such a program. We will then apply it to people in safety-sensitive professions. We will then apply it to young people. And then ultimately the argument will be made to apply it to everybody in the society. Now, I realize that sounds like a 1984-ish type scenario. But, after September 11th, when you look at the reaction to September 11th, when you look at the incredibly indiscriminate but calculating, and I think ultimately pernicious linking of the war on terrorism with the war on drugs. When you look at the Super Bowl ads and the full-page advertisements in the New York Times and the newspapers accusing young people of being accomplices to terrorists because they smoked a joint. When you hear the ambassador to Bolivia call the Coca Growers Union the Taliban of Bolivia. The loose use of this rhetoric, there almost certainly will be another event in this country that reminds us once again of the potential for terrorism to harm large numbers of Americans. And in the fear that consumes this country after the next event, when people are saying, take my freedoms, take my freedoms, take my freedoms, anything to protect myself and my children, if the government responds in ways that are not confined solely to improving the realistic protections against terrorism, but that are used to ultimately expand the control system and to pursue ulterior motives and broader objectives focused on, I believe, the war on drugs, then this country will truly be endangered in a horrible way. All of which is to say, those of us in the reform movement and anybody else who cares about these values have a lot to work to do. And we got to move quickly, hard, and fast so that this country keeps being the kind of place we all want it to be. Thank you very much. Okay. Go ahead.
I want to assure Ethan, all of you here, that as I said a while ago with the panel discussion, that we, in talking about this originally, when Ambassador Jurigian and I first spoke about it, we did not talk about it as saying, this will make an interesting program. This will make an interesting 2 days. We talked about it as something that the Baker Institute could undertake to start to, whether it's whack-a-mole or things popping up or moving a few loose bricks in the wall, as something that we would follow up on, and to use the material we have here, the other materials we can gather, the networks that we have. We do intend to do what we can to cause some rethinking, to generate some, to stimulate some rethinking at serious levels, if that's possible. And I like to think that it is. I am, as several of you have pointed out, I am an optimist. I also want to thank those of you who have come here and been faithful in your attendance. We wish there had been more, but I would like to say to you that there have been, as I mentioned this morning, there have been a number of much larger group watching over the webcast. This will be archived soon so that everybody can watch it who wants to. And I said to some of you yesterday that the Baker Institute web gets 45,000 hits a month, and I was corrected to say it's 75,000 hits a month. Oh. So we do believe that there will be ample distribution of that. Now, a number of those are Ambassador Juridian and I checking to see how many hits there have been, but we don't make quite that much of an impact on it. I'm personally grateful to Secretary James Baker for his approval of this conference and for the efforts that he made to get Administrator Hutchinson here, and for standing by it. For Ambassador Juridian for his similar kinds of efforts, and for his keen interest, as some of you who have participated know that he does indeed have a keen interest in these issues, and I think that we'll not let that lie. And also to our President, Malcolm Gillis, who's not been with us in these days, but spoken very positively from the beginning. And there was some of you know a little bit about this, but there was one letter was written to the university concerning whether or not this was an appropriate event. And Malcolm Gillis had signed several grant applications. So I said, well, I trusted that the president knew what he was, knew what the kinds of things that were going to be discussed here. And he responded, I not only knew it, I wish I could have put it in neon lights. So, which I took to be a good sign. I want to thank also the many people, and I'm sure I'll leave some key ones out, but Captain W.O. King and Jay Guerrero, who those of you who are participants know how much they have and how well they have taken care of things. Suzanne Stroud, who put together the program for us, and the technical staff, Katie Hamilton, Tom Lytle, Derek Raybook, Doward Hudlow, and out of sight but important Hubert Dougherty, who is operating the webcast. All of these people have made this move very smoothly, sometimes even if just moving chairs smoothly, but it's gone very well, and I appreciate very much the technical expertise you have added, as you always do, and the courteousness and the helpfulness that we always get from the staff here. And and I would certainly be remiss not to mention the important role that Jerry Epstein and Al Robison, the president and executive director of the Drug Policy Forum of Texas, have given in sitting down with me a long time ago when I was interested in these things, and they were saying, are you interested in these things, and what might we do, and have had truly played a key role. And that's very important. They are stalwart soldiers in this movement, and I think everyone here, most people here know you and appreciate what you have contributed to and continue to contribute to this effort. I've thanked at various times our supporters, larger and small, but none insignificant. We do appreciate the contributions that you have made, and hope that you will continue to, and know that you will continue to be interested in this particular cause. So I want to ask Ambassador Juridian to conclude here, but again, thank our participants for the rich contribution you have made, and I will be spending my sabbatical for the next, starting 3 weeks from now, for the rest of the year, trying to digest and add to and fashion and make sense of this. And I will doubtless be in touch with you again. But we truly appreciate the time you have taken, the great distances some of you have come, and all of and we recognize that's just the tip, that all of the many contributions you have made and the expertise that you bring, and the labor of love and conscience and morality and ethics. That underlies that. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Bill, especially for your tremendous work in organizing this conference. It would not be possible without you and your close collaboration with the Baker Institute from the very inception of this institute at Rice University. What I would just like to do is not try to conclude the substance of this conference, because that's well beyond my competence. I have concluded that this may be worse than the Arab-Israeli conflict. But I think that some of the most essential issues have been raised during this conference. I am delighted that the administrator, Asa Hutchinson, was here, that Lee Brown was here, in order for us to be able to get the positions of people who have had the responsibility for executing the laws of the land and for leading the policy of various administrations on drug policy. I think some of the issues that have been discussed have been quite comprehensive. As an amateur at this, it's obvious to say there is, as Lee Brown said, no silver bullet, but there is the beginning of an intense analysis and assessment of what works and what doesn't work. I've been struck by the whole approach of drug policy being a criminal issue vis-a-vis being a health issue. One of my initial impressions is that this is not a polarized situation, it's both. There's the issue of enforcement and there's the issue of health, with all that implies. I certainly did note that Asa Hutchinson's statement that while enforcing the law of the land and the policies that he very well described, that he did agree that the drug policy should not just be law enforcement, but did open the window on treatment and education. I'm also struck in our discussions, especially last night with Alex, with others, that obviously there are very important moral issues involved, and that is critical in any society. The moral issues are very important. But I think that, as we were discussing last night, it'll be much more productive if this dialogue is conducted not on the basis of moral disputes, but on policy outcomes. And we discussed last night impact analysis, which I think is a very instructive possible guideline. You know, what is the causality behind decreases in consumption, the rates of overdose that lead to deaths, disease like HIV that was discussed here, the crime rates, corruption, and terrorism? I think this impact analysis is probably the more sober way to go in trying to find out what are the best ways to elaborate public policy. I was also struck by the word globalization and how it facilitates the drug trade, and this is a whole area that needs much more assessment from my point of view because of its global implications. And certainly the need for public dialogue, as we have tried to do here, is essential. With the proponents of various approaches from the official to the alternative approaches, I think is very important along the lines I outlined. I do welcome our guests, both. I will not repeat Bill's thanks to all of you, which I really truly feel, and especially to our guests who came from abroad to give us their insights on what their countries are doing. So I think that this is a good start. As far as the Baker Institute is concerned, as I said at the very beginning of this conference, this is not the first sensitive issue this institute has addressed. We've had conferences on global climate change, we've had conferences on tax policy reform, and we've had this conference on drug policy. And what we basically do, and what our initial intent is to do on this conference, is to assess what has been said, what has been put on the table by all the participants, to probably go back to you with additional comments as we draft our original, our first draft of our report, to take our assessment and our findings to Washington and have further discussions with the people in the administration and the DEA and the other responsible officials, to come back and take a hard look at this and then to publish. This institute publishes only when it has something it considers to be meaningful and that can make a difference. And our policy recommendations are basically very focused, and that is what we're going to try to do, and that's a tremendous task before us. And given the seminal nature of this issue for our society, both in the United States and globally, I think that this is an issue that we will be following and hopefully making a contribution that public policy will be able to be as effective as possible, so as was very well said, that our children and our grandchildren can thrive in a much more healthy and safe environment. Thank you very much for having come.